Okay, we're going to continue with our exploration of words, vocabulary, and the basics of what happens when you die testate, which is with a will, and intestate, which is without a will. We just went over what happens when you decide to have a last will and testament and the basics of what goes into a valid last will and testament. Now we're going to talk about what happens when you die without a last will and testament. And again, that is called intestate. Whenever you see the prefix in on a word, it means the opposite of whatever the root word is. So in, the opposite of testate, dying with a will, is dying without a will. Intestate. Okay? So in your book, I'm starting on page 105, death without a will, intestacy. Okay? Now, there are a couple of words that your book goes through and that we need to go over. Dying without a will is a lot more complicated than dying with a will. I'm just going to start with that. It is much more complicated when you die without a last will and testament. You're entrusting everything that you own, and if you have minor children, your minor children, to a stranger in a black robe. That's what you're doing. And that stranger in a black robe can only operate within a framework of laws that state's legislature has put in place to give that stranger in a black robe, the judge, guidelines within which to take care of your children, if they're minor children or children with a disability, and your stuff. Okay? So let's go through some of the terminology. The first is kindred. Kindred and consanguinity. Those two words actually go together. Consanguinity. Sanguine means blood, con means together. People who are in your same bloodline. Consanguine. Why is that important? Well, if you are consanguine, then you are considered kindred. And again, why is that important? Well, if you die without a last will and testament, the only people who are going to be permitted to get anything from your estate are those who are consanguine and therefore kindred. Now, let me give you a caveat. If there are adopted children, then that is okay. Those are considered consanguine by a legal method. Okay? So consanguinity is a big deal. If you are not in the same bloodline or adopted into that bloodline, the judge doesn't give you anything. And that means that if you are someone who married somebody who had children, and you have not made provisions for those children, in a last will and testament, those children are not consanguine, they are not your kindred, they will not be included in the overall discussion of how to divide your estate. Okay? That doesn't even matter if your stepdaughter you've had since she was a year and a half old and she's now 15. Nothing. Okay? That's not because the judge is a mean person. It just means you didn't do your due diligence in putting together a last will and testament. The statutes say that's it. Then that's it. That's all you got. Okay? The next vocabulary word that your book highlights is on page 106. Ascendant or ancestor. Okay? We look at people's families in charts when we do intestate succession. So if you look on page 106 at exhibit 4.5, there is a deceased Kenneth, and there are ascendant, kindred, and descendant. Ascendant are people that were born before Kenneth was born. Mother, father, aunts, uncles, assuming they're born before Kenneth was born. And the same descending. Children, those descending ancestors are people who are born after Kenneth was born. So children, grandchildren, and that is the chart format that we use when we analyze intestate succession and who gets what. Okay? Now, we have ascendant and we have descendant, but we also have collateral. So if you look on page 107, again, Kenneth is the decedent. Collateral would be brothers and sisters on the same level. Cousins would be collateral also. Okay? If there is someone who is a half brother or a half sister, those are kindred, and so they are included in the chart. Okay? All right, so what are intestate succession laws? Well, every state is just a little bit different, but the state legislature will pass a law for people who die in that particular state without having a last will and testament. And the first thing you do is you put together that chart. Your chart of ascending, descending, kindred, as well as collateral. That's our starting point. Okay? And then what we do is we start with our descending relatives, our children and our grandchildren. Now, there are two concepts that we put into play with our children and our grandchildren. And that is called per stirpes and per capita. A little bit of math here, be forewarned. So if I die and Mr. Hetson has already predeceased me, it's just me. We have 4 children, okay? Per capita distribution means that my estate would be equally split 4 ways among 4 children. Per capita. We're counting heads. Capita means head in Latin. Okay? So each one gets 1/4. The court can't say, your mom liked you better than you, so you get 1/8 and you get the other 1/8. Okay? It doesn't work that way. It is equally split amongst your first level of descending kindred. Okay? Which is your children. And it is split per capita. Now, what if one of my children has predeceased me? So I have 3 living children, but maybe my deceased child has 2 children. Okay? What's going to happen is the court's going to say 4 children is going to say 1/4, 1/4, 1/4 to those children who have not predeceased me, who are still alive, and then they're going to step over the deceased child and divide that child's 1/4 in half between the 2 grandchildren. That's called per stirpes. Stirpes means step. We are stepping over the deceased person and giving that share to that person's children. Okay? Per capita, per stirpes. Those are 2 concepts we use when we are dividing up assets. When we're dividing up the estate. Okay? Now, what if I had 4 children, 1 predeceased me, and that child didn't have any children of their own? Well, there's nobody to step over, and nobody on the other end of the step to give that child's share to. There are no grandchildren. in that case, we're going to do a per capita distribution, 1/3, 1/3, 1/3. So if there are grandchildren or great-grandchildren, we will step over to make sure that that share goes to the next person in that lineal descendancy. Okay? But if there are no grandchildren, 1/3, 1/3, 1/3. I hope that makes sense. What if I have 4 children? One has predeceased me. They didn't have any children, so there are no grandchildren of mine, but they're married. Does the spouse of my deceased child get anything? The answer is no. Why? Consanguinity. You're not married to your spouse. I mean, there's no consanguinity, otherwise you couldn't marry your spouse. So it is a situation of only bloodline. Spouses do not get anything. Okay? So if you look at the exhibit 4.8 on page 112, you can see a breakdown of per stirpes versus per capita. And again, drawing these little diagrams is everything. Otherwise, it's really hard to see who's who. You can have a step person here, a half one here. You know, you don't know. Especially when you have someone who's been married multiple times and has children from multiple marriages, it really gets complicated. So drawing these diagrams is the key to successfully going through putting together your per stirpes and per capita distributions. Okay? Now, what if there are no descending relatives? No kindred. I didn't have any children. And I don't have a spouse. Well, then we go up. Okay? And if you look on page 112, there's a breakdown of what we do when there is no spouse and no children or grandchildren. Okay? The first thing we do is we go to parents. And if the parents have predeceased me, then grandparents, if they are there. If they aren't there, then we go to brothers and sisters, and then cousins. And we keep going until we can find someone to give the stuff to. Okay, but those are our beginning points for if there are no descending. Remember, descending is after I was born, ascending is above, and collateral is on the same plane as me. This is why lots of times you'll hear, oh, I had a great aunt that died and she never had any kids and she left me something. Well, that's because they've gone through this analysis to find the closest relative using the tools of first descending, then ascending, and then collateral. Okay? Now, your book talks about degree of relationship. Don't worry about that. It goes through a lengthy discussion of that. Each statute for each state basically tells you step 1, step 2, step 3, until you find somebody that you can give the estate to. Degree of relationship is really getting more in the weeds than we need to. Okay? Escheat. There's that word again. I'm on page 114. E-S-C-H-E-A-T. The word cheat is right there in the word. Escheat means if they can't find anybody, everything you own goes to the state. The state cheats you out of giving your estate to whomever you wish or to your relatives. If there aren't any relatives, everything goes to the state. I hate that. And for that reason alone, you should always do a last will and testament. And it better be airtight. Because you don't want the state to cheat you by taking everything that you worked for. Okay? All right. Now, what happens if, and that brings us to the end of the overview of intestate succession. So I'm going to have you do assignment 4.2 in that section, just so that I know that you're working on it. And you'll see that in the assignment section. Okay? Now, let's talk about what family members can do to protect their interests when it comes to an estate. The first is a spouse. If there is a surviving spouse, they get deference. In Ohio, the first 1/3 of a decedent's estate goes to the spouse, and the remaining 2/3 can be distributed through per capita per serpes distribution. You may not write a last will and testament cutting your spouse completely out of the last will and testament. You're not allowed to do that. Okay? I had a case once where it was a friend of the family, actually, who came in, and it turns out that he was gay, and he'd been having a relationship with some man for years, and he hated his wife. They'd been married for like 40 years. Hated her, and wanted to cut her out of the will, and wanted her to be surprised at the reading of the will that, she was getting nothing and everything was going to his lover. And I had to sit down with him and say, I'm really sorry, but you're not allowed to do that. If you really want to leave something to your boyfriend, we can set up a trust, we can do something like that, but you are not permitted to cut your wife out of the will. And why is that? Well, it's public policy. We don't want surviving spouses to be left with nothing, especially those who have children. We want them to be able to maintain a lifestyle and be able to support surviving children, and cutting them out of the will wouldn't accomplish that. So that's why we have this public policy. Okay? So we want to make sure that we tell people when they write a last will and testament, at least 1/3 of what you own had better go to your wife, or you're going to make trouble after you're gone. And if you die intestate, a spouse automatically, off the top, gets 1/3. And then the remainder gets split up. Okay? Now, what if I do a last will and testament and I don't leave 1/3 to the surviving spouse? And by the way, in Ohio, it's 1/3. Other states have different percentages. I'm just going to tell you Ohio, and you can look up if you're interested in another state. Okay? So what if I do a last will and testament, and it turns out that what gets left to the spouse really only totals maybe 1/4 of the value of the estate? Well, then the surviving spouse can do what's called an election against the will. And the surviving spouse can say, I don't want what was left to me in the last will and testament. Instead, I'm electing against the will, and I want probate court to, however they do it, through abatements or whatever, figure out how to give me my 1/3. That's how that works. So even if you craft what you think is a very crafty last will and testament, and you think your surviving spouse isn't going to be smart enough to figure out that that's less than 1/3, somebody will tell them. And so you better make sure that you leave a minimum of 1/3, at least in Ohio. Okay? That is a really big deal. And you have no idea how many people think that they can skirt the system. It's like my father used to say, every genius has a way to beat the system at a casino. No, they really don't. Okay? If we have children, those children don't necessarily have to be born as issue of the marriage. in order to be considered consanguine and therefore kindred, and therefore entitled to a distribution under intestate succession. Okay? However, if you do a last will and testament, you don't have to leave anything to anybody but your spouse. There are tons of children out there who are furious because their parents have left them nothing in their last will and testament. And that's perfectly okay. There's nothing they can do about that. Okay? But if you die intestate, doesn't matter how much you didn't like your kids, they're going to get per capita distributions. Now, if you have children that are born outside of marriage, they're still considered consanguine. Therefore, they are entitled to a per capita distribution under intestate succession. Okay? If they're adopted children, again, adopted children are treated the same as children born as issue of marriage. Okay, so you want to make sure that you're aware of all of that as you put things together. Okay? Now, your book talks about homesteads, and we're not going to talk about that right now. There are issues with property that we're going to talk about when we talk about taxes, so we're going to leave that there for right now. Okay? So don't worry about that portion of the chapter. Okay? There is a fact pattern that begins on page 134, use of intestate terminology. And there's a fact pattern, and it goes through Toby dies and all of Toby's relationships. And then there's a breakdown. I'd like you to look that over. The answers are actually given here. And then right after that, on assignment 4.8 on page 137, I'm going to have you do a discussion on that. So in the discussion portion of your module, make sure that you know that that goes with assignment 4.8. Okay? So for this particular part of this chapter, there's going to be a discussion on intestate succession. There is an assignment on intestate succession, and there are vocabulary words that I want you to know. I just need to make sure that you're familiar with certain words for testate and for intestate succession as we go forward. Okay? If you have any questions, please feel free to email me or text me. Thank you.